A millionaire almost drove off the road when he spotted a young woman sitting on the sidewalk with two little twin girls. Curious, he stopped to help and was shocked to find out who she was. The evening sun was slowly setting over the city, painting everything in golden colors. The sounds of city life buzzed around him, car horns, snippets of conversations, and the constant hum of engines created a chaotic symphony. In the midst of all this energy, a woman moved slowly, dragging her feet a bit. Her name was Sarah. Her pale skin and tired eyes told a story of endless exhaustion. Next to her were her two little girls, her precious treasures, the only light in her otherwise dark world. The twins looked almost identical with their curly chestnut hair and curious expressions. Even though hunger had dulled their usual energy, Sarah felt a lump in her throat, not just from being hungry, but from the overwhelming pressure of trying to take care of her daughters in a world that seemed to have turned its back on them. It had been months since they lost their home. The small apartment she rented from her cleaning jobs was taken away by the landlord when she couldn't pay. Sarah had tried everything, looking for extra work, asking friends for help, even thinking about getting a loan. But every door seemed to close in her face. Now she wandered around, hoping to find a place to rest or at least some shelter. The girls didn't fully get what was happening, but they were starting to sense it. They didn't ask about their home or their dad as often as they used to, and it seemed they were getting used to this uncertain new life. Still, a little spark of hope shone in their eyes. They believed their mom would figure it out. "Mom, are we going to eat today?" asked the younger twin, Susan, gently tugging at Sarah's hand. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, trying to hide the growing pain inside her. She knelt down in front of Susan, looked her in the eyes and forced a smile, even though her face showed her sadness. "Very soon, sweetheart. We'll find something. I promise. Mommy always finds a way." Deep down, Sarah felt her strength slipping. The backpack she carried, stuffed with their few belongings, felt heavier than ever. She glanced around, desperately searching for a friendly face or even a hint of hope. But the city, with all its noise and activity, seemed indifferent to her struggles. As they got closer to the city center, the streets got busier. Restaurants overflowed with people in fancy suits, window displays showcased perfect mannequins, and luxury cars zipped by just inches from the sidewalk. It was a different world, one that Sarah no longer belonged to. While crossing a busy intersection, something caught her eye. On the other side of the street was a shiny sports car. Leaning against it was a tall guy in a dark suit and expensive sunglasses. He stood out with his confident posture. Mark. His name popped into Sarah's mind instantly. In that moment, it felt like time froze. The world around her faded, leaving just his face, the face she had tried to forget for years. Mark was part of her past, a relationship filled with passion and chaos. Then one day, he just vanished. No explanation, no goodbye, just silence. Left behind was a broken heart and shattered promises. Soon after, she found out she was pregnant. The twin girls, who looked so much like him, were constant reminders of that time. Sarah had never told Mark about the kids. Fear, confusion, and eventually resentment kept that secret locked away. Mark, casually checking his phone, suddenly looked up. His eyes, hidden behind dark sunglasses, connected with Sarah's, then shifted to the girls beside her. Something about them caught his attention and wouldn't let go. Slowly, he took off his sunglasses and looked again, more carefully this time. The girls. There was something about their faces, their hair, their eyes, even the way they moved that stirred up memories from his own childhood. The realization hit him like a wave. Could they really be mine? That thought struck deep. Mark frowned, trying to make sense of it all. But the resemblance was too strong to brush off as coincidence. It had been so long since he'd last seen Sarah, and he never imagined she might be raising his kids without him knowing. Mark, A guy used to controlling every part of his life felt that grip slipping away. Since building his business empire, his life had revolved around work, investments, and making money. Love and family were nowhere in his carefully planned schedule. Women came and went, but he never let anyone stick around long enough to leave a mark. But now, seeing these girls who might be his, something shifted inside him. Sarah tried to keep walking, her heart racing. She knew Mark had recognized her, and avoiding him wasn't going to work for much longer. The girls looked too much like him. The truth was written all over their faces, and sooner or later, Mark would want answers. At the next crosswalk, Sarah stopped. She couldn't keep going. The girls clung to her skirt, their small hands trembling with exhaustion, just like her own spirit. She scanned her surroundings, desperate for a way out. But it felt like fate had already decided what would happen next. Across the street, Mark stood frozen, his gaze fixed on them. Something inside him pushed him forward, even though he didn't have the words or a plan yet. He knew this moment could change everything. For years, he'd avoided any kind of commitment, but now it seemed he had no choice. Determined, Mark crossed the street. But as he got closer, his usual confidence started to fade. When he was near enough, he saw the fatigue etched into Sarah's face, the dark circles under her eyes, and the sadness she tried to hide behind a faint smile. "Sarah," he murmured her name, like he was calling back a ghost from his past. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with pain and surprise. She had imagined this moment countless times, rehearsed what she might say if she ever saw him again. But now, standing in front of him, all her practiced words vanished. All that was left was silence and the weight of an untold story. Mark glanced down at the girls. He wanted to ask something, but the words wouldn't come. The answer was staring back at him in the curious eyes of the two little girls. "Yes," Sarah said softly, barely above a whisper. "They're your daughters." Mark felt his chest tighten at those words. Sarah's simple, straightforward reply left him frozen. The two small girls who were looking at him with curiosity were his children, twins. That word echoed in his mind, a truth he couldn't ignore. Never in his wildest dreams had he imagined this moment, especially not with Sarah, the woman who had once been the center of his world. Sarah looked at Mark's face, trying to read his reaction beyond the shock that was obvious. She knew this moment would come eventually, but she never thought it would feel this heavy. Relief and fear were battling inside her. Relief because the truth was finally out, and fear because she had no clue how Mark would respond. The years hadn't been easy for Sarah since Mark had left. Life had been a struggle, raising her daughters alone with no help. She had worked her tail off, giving up everything to make sure they had a good life, but it felt like life just kept knocking her down. Standing there in front of Mark, she felt like all her hard work was about to be judged. "Why didn't you tell me?" Mark finally asked, his voice low and mixed with disbelief and disappointment. He couldn't wrap his head around how Sarah had kept something so huge from him, something that could have changed everything. Sarah looked down, fighting back tears. She had replayed this moment in her head so many times, but she never imagined it would be this tough. "I didn't know how," she said softly. "When you left, I had no way to reach you. And later, I was just too scared. I didn't know if you'd even want to know. I didn't know if you'd be happy or if you'd just vanish again." Mark felt a lump in his throat. Sarah's simple words hit him hard, like a wake-up call he'd never seen coming. He had left her behind, no denying that. Chasing a career had made him blind to what really mattered. "I didn't know I had kids," he said, his voice softer now, filled with regret. "I didn't know this was happening." Sarah raised her eyes, tears almost spilling over. "But you didn't even try to find out, Mark. You didn't even try to come back. Not once." Her words hit him harder than he expected. A guy who was used to being in control suddenly realized how lost he had been in his own ambitions. He had never thought about how his absence affected Sarah. Now, facing the reality of being a father, guilt started eating away at him. Mark took a deep breath, looking around. The girls were fidgeting, oblivious to the heavy air between the adults. The youngest, Lily, tugged at her sister's hand, trying to get her attention. "Mommy, can we go home?" she asked, her innocent curiosity shining through. That simple question hit Mark like a punch to the gut. Sarah gently stroked Lily's cheek, hiding the truth behind her eyes because she had no answer for Mark in that moment. It was a glimpse of the weight Sarah had been carrying. Not only had Mark just found out he was a father, but it was clear that Sarah and the girls didn't have a stable home. The harsh reality crashed down on him. "Mommy," Lily repeated, and her sister Anna tugged at their mother's sleeve. Sensing the tension, Mark observed the girls closely. He had spent his life in comfort, but now faced a world he had never truly understood, one filled with struggle and vulnerability. He crouched down to connect with the girls. "What are your names?" he asked gently, trying to bridge the gap. "I'm Lily," the youngest replied shyly, a small smile appearing. "And this is my sister, Anna." Hearing their names made Mark acknowledge a part of his life he had ignored for too long. He straightened up and looked back at Sarah. "Where are you staying?" he asked, already suspecting the answer. Sarah sighed heavily. She knew there was no point in hiding the truth anymore. "We're getting by. Sometimes we find shelter. Sometimes we sleep wherever we can. It's not easy, Mark. I'm doing the best I can, but every day it gets harder." For the first time, Mark felt a hollow feeling within him. Something beyond work had shaken him. He looked at Sarah and the girls again, realizing that walking away wasn't an option this time. Not now. Not like this. "Come with me," he finally said, his voice steady but filled with emotions he didn't fully understand. "You can't live like this. I'll take you somewhere safe." Sarah glanced at him, surprised. She hadn't expected this reaction. For years, she imagined Mark learning the truth and just walking away. She had convinced herself he wouldn't care about her or the girls. But now his offer left her feeling off balance. She knew she couldn't say no, not for herself, but for her kids. They deserved more than she could give them alone. Mark pulled out his car keys and looked at her with determination. "Get in. We need to get out of here." Battling a mix of relief and fear, Sarah took the girls' hands and led them toward the car. She had no idea what the future held, but her only thought was for her daughter's safety. They climbed into the car, and for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt a flicker of hope that maybe things could get better. The engine roared to life, and Mark drove them down the city's bright streets. Inside the car, it was silent. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, hands tightly clasped in her lap. In the back seat, the girls, worn out from the day, had fallen asleep curled up together. Mark kept his eyes on the road, but his mind was elsewhere. Every now and then, he glanced at the rearview mirror to see the girls peacefully sleeping, his daughters. A wave of emotions hit him: amazement, guilt, and a sense of responsibility. A man who had always avoided commitment suddenly found himself facing a family he never asked for but could no longer ignore. When they finally pulled up to his house, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The mansion was lit warmly with a manicured lawn and neat trees. It was a whole other world, far from the struggles she had faced. Mark turned off the engine and looked at Sarah. His expression changed, his usual guarded look replaced by something more genuine. "We're here. The girls can rest here tonight. You don't have to worry about anything," he said, his voice calm but firm. Sarah nodded quietly, feeling completely out of place, like she was stepping into a life she never thought she could belong to. Mark got out of the car and walked to the back door to help with the girls. He awkwardly picked up Lily as if he were holding a child for the first time. Sarah did the same with Anna, feeling her warm, tired body. Together, they climbed the marble stairs to the main entrance, where a middle-aged man in a crisp uniform greeted them. "Everything is ready for your guests," he said, giving Mark a slight nod. Mark responded with a quick nod. "Take our things to the west wing," he instructed before entering the house. Sarah followed behind, taking in the spacious interior. Everywhere she looked, there were expensive paintings, shiny floors, and crystal chandeliers. She felt even more out of place in this fancy environment. Mark pointed to a big, bright room that looked like something out of a fairy tale. "The girls can rest here," he said. Soft, neatly folded blankets were arranged on the bed, and long velvet curtains framed the windows. Sarah gently laid Anna on one of the beds. Mark did the same with Lily, though it was clear he wasn't used to this. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the girls peacefully sleep, completely unaware of the worries that had consumed their parents all day. "Are you sure this is the right thing to do?" Mark asked, breaking the silence all of a sudden. Sarah looked at him, taken aback. "Mark, what are you even talking about? This is all new to me. I don't know how to deal with it," he admitted. For the first time, she heard a hint of vulnerability in his voice, something she had never noticed before. "I didn't see this coming either. Kids and you living like this. I just have no idea what the right move is." Sarah felt a lump in her throat. Should she feel relieved by his honesty or be even more cautious? "I don't know either," she whispered. "For so many years, I've just been getting by. I forgot what it was like to actually live. But these girls, they mean everything to me. They're all that matters." Mark nodded, understanding. "I get it," he said, really listening to her. "I'll do my best to fix things and show you," Sarah responded, lowering her voice, not with words but with her actions. Mark nodded, realizing he had to step up in ways he never had before. He needed to build his life on something more than just success and money. "Let them rest," he said softly. "We'll talk tomorrow," he added, pointing toward the door. Sarah silently agreed. She knew tough decisions were ahead as they left the room. Mark quietly shut the door and turned to her. "You need to rest too. I can get a room ready for you if you want." Sarah shook her head. "No, I'll stay with them. I can't leave them alone in a strange place." "All right," Mark agreed. "In the morning we'll figure everything out." He glanced at her one more time before heading to his own suite. Sarah stood quietly in the hallway, leaning against the wall and letting out a heavy sigh. She knew a lot of questions were waiting for answers, but at least her daughters were safe, and that was all that mattered. The next morning, the first rays of sunlight seeped through the heavy curtains of the mansion, filling the room with a soft glow. The girls were still asleep, all snuggled up in their cozy blankets. Sarah had been awake for a bit, but hadn't gotten up yet. She lay there, staring at the ceiling and listening to her daughter's steady breathing while replaying the events of the past day in her head. She was in Mark's house, the guy who had broken her heart, but now he seemed to be the only one offering her help. It was both ironic and terrifying. For years, she had learned to rely only on herself and trust no one. And now everything felt upside down. The very walls of the house reminded her of the huge gap between their worlds, one where she had to fight for every little thing, and another that seemed to be built on endless wealth and comfort. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. The butler came in with a polite smile. "Good morning," he said softly. "Mark and Victoria have asked me to prepare breakfast for you and your children. They're waiting for you in the dining room when you're ready." Sarah nodded, surprised by the unexpected kindness. "Thank you," she said quietly after the butler left. Sarah slowly approached her daughters' beds and began waking them up. Susan was the first to open her eyes and smile. "Mom, this bed is so soft," she whispered, snuggling deeper into the blanket. Mary followed her sister's lead, still half asleep. Sarah smiled at her daughters, but deep down she felt torn. She knew this was just a temporary relief. She helped the girls get dressed, reminded of how little they had left. It was such a stark contrast to the luxury surrounding them as they made their way downstairs to the spacious dining room. Mark was already waiting at the long wooden table, looking at them with a warm smile. But Sarah noticed something deeper in his eyes, maybe uncertainty or guilt. The girls, a bit shy but excited, slowly approached the table. "Good morning," Mark said, his voice gentle, trying to ease the tension. "Good morning," the girls replied quietly as they took their seats. Sarah lingered a bit longer, her gaze intense as if trying to figure out Mark's true intentions. The breakfast spread was impressive: fresh fruit, hot bread, juices, and dishes the girls had never seen before. They ate with visible enjoyment, their eyes sparkling with joy. Mark watched them silently, taking in every detail. For him, a guy used to fine dining, this moment felt particularly meaningful. Suddenly he realized these girls were having a blast with what had always seemed ordinary to him. After a brief pause, he turned his gaze to Sarah. "Sarah," he began, his voice steady yet friendly. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened yesterday, and I want to talk about what comes next." Sarah put down her fork and looked at him closely. She knew this conversation was coming. "All right," she replied, signaling that she was ready to listen. Mark took a sip of his coffee before continuing. "I know I put you in a really tough spot, and I'm not going to pretend it's not my fault. But I can't change the past. The only thing I can do now is try to provide a better future for you." Sarah narrowed her eyes, keeping her emotions in check. His words sounded sincere, but she wasn't sure if she was ready to trust him. "And what exactly are you proposing?" she asked cautiously. Mark paused for a moment before responding. "I want you to stay here, at least for now, while we figure out a long-term solution. This house is safe and it has everything you need. I can't let you end up on the streets again." Sarah felt a mix of emotions, relief and hesitation. "Stay here," she repeated thoughtfully, her voice shaking a bit. "It sounds tempting, but I can't just depend on you, Mark, not after everything that's happened." Mark met her gaze, his expression serious. "I'm not asking you to depend on me. I'm just offering help for the girls. They deserve better than what they had." His words were convincing, and Sarah knew he was right. Her daughters did deserve better. After a long silence, she sighed and quietly said, "All right, we'll stay. But only for a while until I can figure everything out." Mark nodded, accepting her decision. "That's all I'm asking." In that moment, a fragile truce seemed to settle between them. It felt delicate, but maybe this was the first step towards something more. The day at the mansion passed in a strange silence, as if the atmosphere itself was adjusting to the new residents. The girls eagerly explored the huge house, their laughter echoing through the halls as they ran through the garden, hid behind neatly trimmed bushes, and played tag among the trees. Sarah watched the girls, noticing how their faces lit up with joy. It was such a rare sight lately, but she still felt a bit out of place. This house, this life, it all felt so foreign to her. She knew this was just a temporary situation, but even this short time with Mark brought back a flood of old feelings and questions. Mark was trying hard to show that he cared about more than just business and money. He spent time with the girls, watching them play and even attempting to join in. She saw him trying to play with them, a bit awkwardly, and while she couldn't deny he was making an effort, there still felt like there was this invisible wall between them. Just then, as the girls dashed out of the garden, Sarah heard footsteps behind her. She didn't need to look to know it was Mark. "They're happy," he said quietly, watching the girls run around. "They've always been happy, no matter what." Sarah kept her eyes on the kids. "All I ever wanted for them was a life free of the struggles I had to face." Mark fell silent, thinking about what she said. He couldn't imagine what it was like for Sarah to raise 3 kids on her own. "I'm trying to change," he finally said, his voice steady. "I know I've messed up, but I don't want to be that guy anymore." Sarah turned to him, looking a bit cautious. "I hear you, but I'm not sure I can trust you again. The girls see you as their dad, but you need to show that you can actually be one. Not just with words, but with actions." Mark nodded, getting it. He knew regaining her trust wouldn't be a walk in the park. "I will," he said simply but with determination. Their chat got interrupted by the happy shouts of the girls. Susan tripped and fell onto the grass, and Sarah rushed over to help her up, gently wiping away the small scrape. "It's okay, my girl," she said softly, kissing Susan on the forehead. Mark stepped closer, but Susan was still crying and instinctively clung to Sarah. Only her mom could make it better. This hit Mark hard. He realized how distant he was from the kids, even though they were his. "Sorry," he muttered more to himself than to Sarah. She stood up, holding Susan. "It's fine," she said calmly. "It's nothing. She'll forget about it soon." Sarah added, trying to comfort him. But Mark felt helpless. He was used to fixing things with money and influence, but those tools felt useless here. When they went back inside, the girls immediately got distracted by the treats waiting for them in the dining room. Mark watched them from a distance, feeling a warm glow from their happiness. "You're a great mom," he suddenly said, looking at Sarah sincerely. "I don't know how you did it, but you managed on your own. And they're happy. That's what matters." Sarah looked at him, surprised. "I didn't have a choice," she replied honestly. "I had to keep going for them." Mark nodded. "Now I have to show I can be part of their lives." Sarah didn't say anything, but her expression softened a bit. That evening at dinner, the girls were buzzing with energy, excitedly sharing stories about their adventures in the garden. Mark listened with a genuine smile, feeling like this moment was one of the most important in his life. Sarah, sitting across from him, still seemed guarded, but for the first time in ages, she started to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could actually change. The next morning, everything felt peaceful at home, but inside Sarah, a sense of unease was creeping in. She woke up before the girls and spent a long time staring out the window at the neatly trimmed bushes in the garden. She felt torn. On one hand, she was relieved that the girls were finally safe from the streets and uncertainty. On the other hand, there was Mark, the guy who had left her alone before, now trying to be involved in their lives. But could she trust him? When the girls woke up, they were full of energy and soon started making noise. They got ready for breakfast, and their happiness gave Sarah some comfort. When they came downstairs, Mark was already waiting for them. He looked a little tense, and Sarah noticed right away. After breakfast, when the girls ran off to play outside, Mark approached Sarah carefully. "I thought it might be nice to take the girls out for a bit," he said. "How about a trip to the park?" Sarah looked up, surprised, but thought it was a good idea. "Okay," she replied. "I think they'll enjoy that." The drive to the park was calm, though there was a slight awkwardness between Sarah and Mark in the car. The girls, however, were excited, chatting away about what they wanted to do. As soon as they parked, the girls bolted out of the car and headed for the playground. Sarah and Mark stayed nearby, watching them. "They adapt so quickly," Mark remarked, watching the girls laugh and slide down. "They're just kids," Sarah replied quietly, her voice tinged with sadness. "They don't understand what it's like to feel broken inside." Mark frowned slightly, her words hitting him hard. "I'm trying to fix everything," he said after a pause. "I know it's not easy, but I want to be part of their lives." Sarah didn't answer right away, her gaze still on the girls. "It's not just about them, Mark," she finally said. "You were part of my life too, and you broke it. I'm still not sure if I can let you back in." Her words were direct and stung, but Mark knew she was right. The silence hung between them until Sarah noticed a girl on the playground tangled in some ropes. Mark immediately rushed over to help her, surprisingly nimble for someone who used to avoid these kinds of situations. When he returned, his expression was serious. "They deserve better," he said, looking her in the eye. "I know," she replied, "and that's why I need to be sure you're ready to do things the right way. Not just now, but going forward." After their trip to the park, the girls were happy and tired, chatting away as they debated who was faster on the slide and who swung higher on the swings. Mark smiled quietly, listening to their chatter. But Sarah still felt on edge, even though she could see Mark was really trying to connect with the girls. She couldn't shake off the worry that he might disappear again, just like before. When they got back to the mansion, the girls dashed to their rooms to play, while Sarah stayed downstairs watching Mark as he took off his jacket and settled into a chair. "You look exhausted," she said, sitting across from him. "It's a bit unusual," he admitted, glancing at her. "I'm not used to spending time with kids." Sarah nodded. "They need more than just a day at the park, Mark. They deserve stability. I need to be sure you can give that to them." Mark leaned forward, hands clasped in front of him. "I know my words don't mean much right now," he said seriously, "but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to give them the best." Sarah studied him, trying to see how sincere he was. "Okay," she finally said, "then we'll start with small steps." Mark smiled. "Sounds like a plan." That evening at dinner, the girls filled the house with laughter, excitedly chatting about their day at the park and making plans for a picnic in the garden the next day. Mark listened, genuinely happy to see his daughters so joyful. Sarah, watching them, felt herself softening a little. She knew he was trying, but it still wasn't enough to regain her trust. The next morning, the girls woke up earlier than usual, buzzing with excitement for the day ahead. Susan was the first to rush out of her room. Mom, let's go somewhere again today," she shouted. "We'll need to talk to Mark first, but if he takes us, of course we'll go," her mother replied. Mark overheard and immediately chimed in. "Of course, girls. I'll take you wherever you want. How about a picnic?" "Yay!" the girls cheered as the day outdoors unfolded. By the end of the day, they were tired but happy, slowly making their way back to the car with glowing faces. Sarah noticed how tightly Susan was holding Mark's hand, as if she was starting to feel safe with him. When they returned to the mansion, the girls dashed to their room, ready for more fun. Already planning their next adventure, Sarah decided to stay downstairs to chat with Mark. "Everything went well today," she said, "but Mark, you need to get this. One good day doesn't fix everything." Mark nodded, looking down. "I get it," he said, "but I want them to know I'm here." "And that's not enough," Sarah replied, her voice gentle but firm. "Being here is easy, but you have to show them you can stick around no matter what." Mark paused, realizing she needed more than just his words. But how could he prove that when his past kept dragging him back? Just then, the doorbell rang, interrupting them. Sarah flinched and Mark frowned. "I'll get it," he said. At the door stood a tall guy in a sharp suit, Mark's old business partner. "You're always on time, Mark," he said flatly as Mark gestured for him to come in. Sarah could tell this visit was important. She stepped back, watching the two men head to the office. For almost an hour, she could hear muffled voices. The conversation seemed to get more intense, and at one point, she heard Mark raise his voice. "You can't just leave all this in the past. It doesn't work that way." "I'm not trying to," Mark's partner shot back, "but I won't let it destroy my family." Those words made Sarah freeze. What were they talking about? When the door finally opened, Mark quickly left, giving Sarah a brief nod. His face was grim, and he walked fast. Mark paused in front of her but didn't say anything right away. "What did you talk about?" she asked, her voice steady but cautious. "It's not important," he replied, avoiding her question. Sarah stared at him, her eyes blazing with anger. If it affects me or the girls, it's important. Mark sighed. I'll handle it, I promise. Your promises don't mean anything to me anymore, Sarah shot back coldly. I want to know the truth. Mark looked at her, his eyes full of mixed emotions. Give me some time. I'll tell you everything. But right now, I just can't. She turned away, feeling the mistrust grow. You don't have much time, Mark. Later that evening, after the girls were asleep, Sarah sat by her bedroom window, staring out at the dark garden. Her mind was heavy and restless. The conversation with Mark and his vague answers triggered old fears. She started to realize his past could be way more complicated than she'd thought. But what exactly was he hiding? And how could it mess with their future? The door creaked open softly and Mark peeked in. Can I come in? He asked cautiously. Sarah nodded without turning. I thought we needed to talk, he said, walking in and closing the door behind him. Sarah didn't respond, still looking out the window. You're angry, he said after a pause. Of course I'm angry, Sarah replied, finally turning to face him. Her eyes showed exhaustion and fury. You're hiding something again? How can I trust you if you're not being honest? Mark sighed heavily and sat across from her. It's not as simple as you think. There are things from the past that could hurt, not just me. Sarah tensed, suddenly alert. Not directly, he added quickly, but there are people who might use my past against me and it could affect you. Sarah frowned, her hands clenched into fists. You should have told me this sooner. I know, Mark admitted. I was trying to protect you, but maybe I messed that up. Sarah gave a faint smile. Mark lowered his head. You know excuses won't work anymore. Mark, he's my old partner, he began. We worked together on a few projects and not all of them were clean. I thought I'd left that behind, but apparently he decided to remind me of it. And you're saying this could threaten us? Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. I won't let that happen, Mark said firmly. I'll do everything to keep you safe. Sarah stood up and started pacing the room, her steps restless. I don't know if I can believe this. How many more secrets are you hiding from me? He got up and walked over to her. I know I've earned your mistrust, but I want to fix this. I'm ready to tell you everything. Just give me time. Sarah stopped and looked at him. You really don't have much time, she said. Mark nodded, knowing every move he made would now be under scrutiny. The next day, the tension in the house was palpable, even in the smallest things. Sarah tried to avoid unnecessary talks with Mark, focusing on the girls who were happily playing outside. Mark, on his part, was quiet and deep in thought. He knew that every minute of silence only made Sarah's mistrust grow. By lunchtime, he finally decided to approach Sarah, who was in the living room. We need to talk, he said seriously. Sarah looked at him. About what? About how you're hiding something again. Mark nodded. About the past, and what I should have told you right away. She motioned for him to sit, keeping silent. All right, I'm listening, she said, her tone cold and distant. Mark took a moment to gather his thoughts. When Mark and I worked together, I didn't realize right away that some of his methods were illegal. It was about financial schemes, investments that weren't exactly clean. When I found out, I decided to back out. But it wasn't that simple. Sarah listened closely, her face calm, but concern was clear in her eyes. Walking away meant leaving behind some projects and part of my reputation, he continued. Mark didn't take it well. He's been holding a grudge ever since. And now he's back. He's back? She asked, surprised. Yeah, Mark replied. He wants me to join one of his schemes again, threatening to expose my past if I refuse. Sarah exhaled slowly, trying to process this. And what are you going to do? She asked. I already told him no, Mark said firmly, but I know he might try other ways to get to me. I won't let him hurt you. Why didn't you tell me this earlier? Sarah's voice shook a bit. I was scared, Mark said, admitting it. I was afraid you'd push me away again. She stared out the window, lost in thought. You still don't get it, Mark, she finally said. I can't depend on someone who keeps secrets about stuff this big. Mark hung his head, not able to argue with her. I'll change, he said quietly, but I need some time to prove it. Sarah looked at him, her face tense. I'll give you a chance, she said finally, but only for the girls. Mark felt a tiny wave of relief, but knew this was just the start of a long road to earning her trust back. Days went by slowly, and despite his promise, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that his past was still hanging over him. Every text or call made him anxious. He knew Mark wouldn't just threaten him, but his biggest worry was the trouble it could bring to Sarah and the girls. Meanwhile, Sarah tried to focus on their daily routine. She spent more time with the girls, enjoying their laughter and playtime in the yard. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that Mark wasn't being completely honest. One night after the girls were in bed, Sarah came downstairs to talk to him. Mark was at his desk, looking over some documents, but seemed distracted. Mark, she said, trying to get his attention. He looked up. We need to talk, she continued. He set his papers aside and motioned for her to sit down. What's wrong? He asked. You still seem so tense, she said. You're acting like everything's fine, but I can tell it's not. Mark sighed heavily. I don't want this to affect you, he admitted. Mark might try to use my past against me, but I'll do everything I can to keep you safe. This isn't just about us, Mark, she said firmly. You need to deal with this, not just for us, but for yourself too. Her words made him think. She was right. He couldn't keep running from his problems. What do you want me to do? He finally asked. Be honest, Sarah replied. If you're serious about starting fresh, you need to stop running. Mark sat quietly, considering her words. I'll talk to Mark, he said finally. I'll make it clear that I won't let him drag me into his schemes again. Okay, Sarah nodded. But remember, Mark, this is your last chance. He looked at her seriously, a flicker of determination in his eyes. I won't let you down, he promised. The next day, Mark went into town to confront Mark. He knew it wouldn't be an easy chat, but he couldn't let fear control his life anymore. Sarah stayed home with the girls, trying not to think about what might happen. Deep down, she knew this conversation would decide not just Mark's future, but the safety of their family. When Mark came back that evening, he looked worn out, but had a new confidence in his eyes. Is everything okay? Sarah asked as she met him in the hallway. Yeah, he replied. I'm not tied to Mark anymore. I made it clear he can't manipulate me. Sarah studied him closely. Are you sure? Absolutely, Mark said firmly. It's all on us now. She nodded, feeling for the first time that he was really ready to turn his life around. Weeks went by and things at home started to feel more stable. Sarah got used to having Mark around, and she noticed how hard he worked to bond with the girls and take care of her too. Every day the girls would run to greet him when he got home, their laughter filling the house with warmth that had been missing for so long. Slowly, Sarah started to feel a sense of calm return to their lives. Mark seemed genuinely committed to leaving his past behind. He was attentive, caring, and made an effort to be present for the girls and for her as well. One evening after dinner, while the girls played in the living room, Sarah and Mark sat out on the porch. You know, Sarah said, looking up at the stars, a few months ago I couldn't have imagined us sitting here like this. Me neither, Mark replied with a small smile. Back then, everything felt so compy.